Councillor. Good afternoon, members of the House. Good afternoon to the individuals who are viewing in the gallery and who are listening to us at this sitting. It's sad, Madam Presiding Officer, that the airwaves have been filled with several reports of intimate partner violence that resulted in the death of many of our women in Trinidad and Tobago. And as a result, Madam Presiding Officer, when I saw the motion, I thought, sure, this is heading in the right direction. It means that we are acknowledging that this really is an issue and that we are acknowledging that very concrete steps need to be taken. And I came into the House this afternoon, Madam Presiding Officer, hoping that we would really jumpstart that process of taking very clear steps. Hoping that this, as my colleague pointed out, does not become just one of those feel-good things that we stand up here and talk about and then nothing happens after that. And I'm still praying and I am still hoping that that really is not what is going to happen today. Madam Presiding Officer, I want to take just a little bit of time to make a very a distinction, because depending on where you see the term and depending on who you see talking about it and depending on the kinds of statistics that we're looking at, we need to be clear on what we're talking about. Trinidad and Tobago has a Domestic Violence Act that in essence basically says we are supposed to report domestic violence and we're supposed to collect data on domestic violence. But I want to be clear that the definition of domestic violence in that act is one that is a relatively broad one. And I want to read it specifically. It says, it includes physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological or financial abuse committed by a person against a spouse, child, or any other person who is a member of the household or dependent. So I just wanted to make that clear that when the TTPS, for example, speak about domestic violence data, that they are not just talking about intimate partner violence and they are not just talking about violence against women and girls, but they are including a kind of wider definition of domestic violence. So we need to be very clear about that when we are looking at the statistics and we're talking about the statistics that's officially reported. According to the World Health Organization, if we're talking about intimate partner violence, and I am most of the times when we're talking about that or what has been said before, I think is referring more to intimate partner violence, which again refers to physical, sexual, emotional, other kinds of controlling behavior that relates to an intimate partner. So you may have intimate partner violence that is not, or you may have domestic violence according to the Domestic Violence Act that is not necessarily intimate partner violence. And I wanted us to just be clear about that and to be clear that when the TTPS is reporting on domestic violence, they may be talking about something a little different to what social science speaks of. Madam Presiding Officer, I have had very personal experiences, as many, if you listen to the statistics, many of us have experienced intimate partner violence one way or the other. And I have had the privilege of being outside of Trinidad and Tobago when I had the actual courage to do something about it. And I want to kind of walk through the steps that were taken because it outlines something that is critical and something that is missing in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is really a comprehensiveness of a system that is able to respond to it. So the example starts with me being at school in the US and knowing that there were counselors at the school that I could go to. Went to the counselors, explained the situation, explained that I think I was ready to access help and to see, what is available. And they were able very quickly to lead me to free legal advice, which is critical. So I went in having the situation, having little or no money, less than no money, as a matter of fact. And I was able to get free legal advice on what to do. The legal advice helped me walk through the court system because what I needed to get was what is known as a protection from abuse order. And those steps, because the social system was there to protect me, I was able to walk through the steps of getting the protection from abuse order done quickly and then delivered, because that's the next critical step. By the time I got back home to my apartment, the person who I was with at the time had already been served and was already out of the house. And I was accompanied with a police officer to go back into the home. And in addition to that, I also had the assurance that if anything happened and I called the police again, they would come. Now, I use that example because I know for a fact that if I were in Trinidad and Tobago while going through that, those steps would not have been as seamless as they were there. And that, Madam Presiding Officer, is what I thought we were coming into the house today to outline specifically what were the strategies that we are agreeing to around this U. As a matter of fact, Madam Presiding Officer, one of the things that I frequently do before we come to this house is that I share the motions with wider public, but I also specifically in this situation share the motion with people who are in the social sciences and are supposed to be part of the protective system that we should be working on. And one of the questions that was asked last night was, so Faith, what is the strategy? And I said to them, I don't know, but I am hoping that by the end of today, we know what is the strategy that we are agreeing to implement. Now, listening now, I am almost forced to conclude that the strategy really is to form the committee. And then the committee would then do the work. But as my colleague so rightly stated, we've been here and we've done that for 3 years already. And I am yet to specifically identify what any of the committees that we stood here and agreed on have done. And I don't know, Madam Presiding Officer, that that method will work in this case, because it has not worked before, and there is no reason to think that if we keep doing the same thing over and over, it is certainly going to give a different result. Madam Presiding Officer, some of the things that were highlighted that were critical, and some have already been touched on, but I want to touch again, is the fact that if we are responding to this, we need to have very clear guidelines on what next. We have first responders, and like my colleague, I would like to congratulate the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service in identifying the fact that gender-based violence is an issue and having developed that unit. And because I actually did quite a bit of work on the child protection system in Trinidad and Tobago and did the assessment of the child protection system in Trinidad and Tobago, I know that when the TTPS implemented their child protection unit, it included quite a bit of training and retraining and so forth for the officers in that unit. So I was hoping that this gender-based violence unit would also have that kind of training and retraining. I am not convinced that that is the case just yet, but we can still hope that that will actually happen. But the question that keeps coming up, Madam Presiding Officer, is for the first responders, what do they do? Where do we go? Where are, as been outlined, the safe spaces for women and children? And that is critical because we need to have the safe spaces for women and children. Ideally, Madam Presiding Officer, these safe spaces should not be run by the government. The NGO and FBO sectors and so forth should really be the ones spearheading those kinds of safe spaces. But the reality remains that the government has a responsibility to ensure that in the event that the NGOs are not picking up the slack, the government is doing it. We had what I thought was a pretty decent option within the government service, where we had those safe spaces worked out, or at least a specific safe space worked out. And again, I was hoping that after many, many, many months, because I remember being the one standing right here several months ago and asking about one of these safe spaces, the Women Empowerment Technological Center. And we were told it was up and running, but they just needed to do a little bit of refurbishment, if I am not mistaken. Only to hear now that the little refurbishment that should have happened then, because that was the official answer, Madam Presiding Officer, is yet to be complete, and that we are now about to move, and that it means that that service is not necessarily available right now. I was hoping for better news than that, Madam Presiding Officer. We also need to have very clear family-friendly policies and family-friendly spaces. That includes at work, it includes in the health facilities, it includes all of these areas because, unfortunately, when our families need help, they come to us. And they cannot come to us to a space that is not friendly to them. Madam Presiding Officer, confidentiality. That is an issue that continues to be a thorn in the side of Tobago. Yes, we are small. And because we are small, Madam Presiding Officer, it means that we have to do so much more to ensure that confidentiality is maintained. And I just want to take a second, because sometimes when we say confidentiality, people think we're talking about anonymity, and there's a difference. Anonymity means we don't know who we're dealing with, meaning the person, we don't have the name or the identity of the person. For example, if we send blood to a lab and we just have a number, the blood just sees the number, they don't know whose blood it is, which is very different to confidentiality, where you know the information, but because of your professional ethics, you are required by law, required by standards, not necessarily law, to keep that information to yourself. And I know for a fact that many of the people who need help simply refuse to come and ask for it because they know their information would be in the streets even before they've left the place where they sought help. So that has to be a critical part. And that includes within our social services sector, within our health sector, within the policing sector. That is critical. Now, Madam Presiding Officer, there's also an area where I think we have not been doing it in Trinidad and Tobago. But because this issue of intimate partner violence is so widespread, one of the tools that have been used in other places, and it seems to get pretty decent responses, is to implement intimate partner violence screening tools within, for example, the health service. And that needs to be done in a very specific way for it to actually work. One, it needs to be systematic. And when we say systematic, it means you don't just look at the person who looks like they've been beaten and ask the question. No. The same way you take blood pressure and blood sugar for practically everybody who walks into the health facility, Madam Presiding Officer, the same way you would ask every person who comes in these questions. So it needs to be systematic, so people know that it is part of the routine treatment. It's part of the routine care that is provided. It is also recommended, Madam Presiding Officer, that a very clear script is developed, because you don't want to leave it up to the individual professional to ask the way they want to ask the question, because how you ask a question and the wording and the phrasing and so forth influences the response that you get. You also, because this is a very sensitive area, having a script would allow the health professionals to practice ahead of time with their friends and family and so forth, to ensure that they are able to do it and able to control the inflection and able to control their facial expression and those things when asking the questions. So it is recommended that you start with what are known as normalizing statements. An example. Next, I'm going to ask you questions about intimate partner violence, and these are questions that we ask all of our patients, so the patient knows this is a normal part of it. You also need to continue normalizing the discussion. And another way of doing that is saying, we know that couples argue. We know that there's usually tension and so forth. This is normal. But when you and your partner argue, do you or does this happen? So you're starting with this is normal. We understand that this is normal. But then you ask the next very specific question. And some of the questions that are recommended, and it doesn't need to be any very lengthy thing. If you are, one question could be, within the last year, have you been pushed, shoved, slapped, hit, kicked, choked, or otherwise physically hurt by your partner or by an ex-partner? Another question, if the person is pregnant, since you've been pregnant, have you been hit, slapped, kicked, or otherwise physically hurt by someone? Another question, within the last year, has anyone forced you to have sexual activities that you did not want? Another question, a very simple, generic, are you afraid of anyone? These are all standard questions that are used in intimate partner violence screening in health facilities throughout the world. And we can start implementing them here because we know it is happening and we just want to get the in to start the conversation with some people. Of course, I was about to say it doesn't need to be said, but the reality is in Tobago it probably does need to be said. These,
you have 8 more minutes speaking time.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. These screening questions need to be done in private. So we may need to reconfigure some of the areas where we do our health interviews to ensure that we have real privacy when we're asking these kinds of questions. We need to also ensure that the person who is doing it understands the importance of therapeutic communication, which means actually paying attention when the person is talking to you, not necessarily writing or scripting or doing things to let them know that your answer is really important to me. And probably most importantly, if there is a positive screening, meaning you recognize that yes, the answer to one or more of these questions is yes, what do you do? It is important to avoid statements that incite fear. And as much as we all want to do it, as much as we all want the next step to be, let's call the police, we've recognized that if that is the next statement, many victims don't answer correctly because they don't want that as their next option. That has been studied throughout. So instead, what is recommended is that we ask, do you want help at this time? Because the genuine answer could be no. And if you ask the question every time, one day you would probably get a yes response. You also offer the various options and the various choices. But you need to also encourage safety planning. Because, Madam Presiding Officer, one of the things that is a fact is that even though we continue to say to women in particular, why don't you leave your abusive partner? The reality is, Madam Presiding Officer, that the moment just before you leave and the moment right after you leave is the deadliest of moments. And the cases recently in Trinidad and Tobago that have met the airwaves are cases where they just left and are running or just trying to leave. So you need to ensure, we need to ensure that whenever we have these conversations, even if it is with your friend or family or whoever that you're trying to help, a safety plan is absolutely critical. Because for many, many, many women, they are actually saving their lives by staying in the relationship at the time. because that is the safer of the options. Madam Presiding Officer, as I said at the beginning, I am hoping that this is not just one of those things where we come here and speak fancy, because there are people outside who are listening, and there are people outside who absolutely need our help. And as one of the individuals who I spoke with recently said, and let me pull up exactly what was said, and I'm closing with this, Madam Presiding Officer. The person who works very closely with victims and perpetrators in these situations says, and I quote, "The entire process can be overwhelming, and usually persons in the situations are confused, disoriented, and scared. It requires a lot of patience, care, and tenderness from responders. Confidentiality and respect is also needed." But the person ended by saying, "But the lack of resources makes this extremely difficult." We need to figure out, Madam Presiding Officer, how we could create a space where people can get the resources and can follow through the process from prevention all the way to response as seamlessly as possible, because in a situation like this, Madam Presiding Officer, we're talking literally life and death. Thank you.